Hello, welcome to the soup station. Of course I get sick right when I'm trying to get back into videos, but we're gonna push through it. Today I'm coming to you to share my July and August wrap up. In July I read 5 books and in August I read 8, and I will admit a lot of them were for videos, so if you want to see me doing more in-depth conversation about any of them, there's probably something about it, because kind of the only reason that I was reading these past couple of months was if it was for a video. I wasn't really feeling motivated otherwise. So in July I read 5 books. The first one being Manhunt, which I did read in June, but I didn't finish it. I have a reading vlog specifically for this book if you want to see why I didn't finish it, but I wanted to see if anything happened that would maybe change my opinion, so I forced myself to get through it, and I still wasn't the biggest fan. If you're curious about my specific star ratings, I do link my Goodreads and story graph, but we're just gonna talk vague opinions here. This book is an end-of-the-world story where people who have enough testosterone in their bodies turn into monsters. It's incredibly graphic and gory and just uncomfortable to get through. Huge content warning for sexual assault. I think it's written for a very specific audience. If you like books that make you feel dirty, then this is kind of that. I do think it's very much made for the author to indulge in these ideas. I thought there were a lot of perspectives, but I just got bored. I didn't feel like there was anything happening for a majority of it, and when there was something happening, it was fairly predictable, or I just wasn't connected enough to the story to care. I did see some people saying that to them this represented a really cool trans story and it represented the trans rage that they felt. So if you are able to connect to this book, or you do think that the author accurately portrayed how you feel, then more power to you, you know? Like, I don't want to take that away from anybody. But for me personally, it just didn't feel good to read this. And I wasn't even unsettled past the first couple of chapters by any gory descriptions. I felt like they kind of faded out. And I don't know if that's just me being desensitized after going through this book, or if it genuinely just wasn't as obvious in the book. I don't know, I thought it had a lot of potential. Incorporating transness into an end-of-the-world story, I thought that could be really cool, but I personally didn't think it was done very well. And this author is a little bit controversial. She has said some things that some people don't like. I don't really feel like getting into all that again, but meh. The second book that I read in July was Coming Out of the Coffin. It's the only one out of these that I don't have a physical copy of because I was fortunate enough to get an ARC, an advanced reader's copy. The author very kindly offered to send me one, see if I wanted to read it, because he had seen me doing these June videos talking about queer books. This is my first time getting the opportunity to do something like that, so it's really exciting. And genuinely, I think this book was such a fun time. The book is a horror comedy, and the character types are really clearly laid out. They really fit into their molds, but not in a bad way. More in like a cheesy movie type of way where you just know who these characters are. It feels really easy to connect with them because you know who they're supposed to be. The main character is a self-conscious, insecure vampire who's struggling with his personal identity, so you're getting this layer of humanity on top of the fact that he is obviously a vampire. He's dealing with this supernatural thing while also trying to fit into the human world. And the thing that makes him stand out is he's trying not to drink blood, which is uncommon for a vampire, and he's also gay, which is less accepted in the human world. So he's dealing with these two things that sort of isolate him from other people. And he's trying to figure out how to fit in while also embracing who he wants to be. And the really fun thing about this book is there are some plot elements that are left open, which could potentially lead into a sequel, so it's something to look out for. I was kind of debating if I should put school books into these videos and into my book count, but they are still books that I read. I will count the assigned readings for school. One of them was Canaanland. This is by Albert J. Roboto, and I read it for a religious studies course. I don't really have much to say about these because they're assigned readings, so it's not like I chose to do them. This book aims to fill in the gaps of education and undo the neglect of the topic of African American religious history, which is something that we're really not taught at all in public schools. And that sucks, because it's something that's so crucial to American religious history and just American history in general. And so frequently, the public school system tends to write over really any person of color experiences. They very much try to center education around white people. This book highlights things that are frequently left out. I am not good at history up here. That's one of the things that will not get into my brain whatsoever. But if you are somebody who's into that or who is more able to understand it, then I would recommend this book. The fourth book that I read was another one that I was wrapping up from June, and it's Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. I was really interested in the concept because I had never seen a story like this before. This book is following 3 people. One of them is a trans woman who would like to have a child but can't biologically get pregnant. The second is her previous partner who was trans but detransitioned back to a man. And the third is the person that man man is now dating. And in a turn of events, he got her pregnant. And you're following this trio as they try to figure out what to do with this baby. Because Reese, the trans woman, would like to be a mother. But since she can't have the child, Ames, the ex, says, hey, why don't you talk to the person that I'm with, who is currently pregnant, and maybe you can co-mother in this situation, and it can be the three of us raising this child. This book is really interesting because it goes into relationship dynamics and dealing with personal identity while also trying to figure out the pressure that comes along with parenthood and being in queer spaces. There are so many different categories that these people fall into, and it's really interesting to see how they all intersect. I thought that the writing felt very sophisticated. There was a lot of language and a lot of words that I just didn't know. And that's not to say that it was hard to read, it just forced me to pay attention. And I appreciate the author for not just using easy language to throw out a story. The characters in this are not always good people. They make decisions that are entirely personal that could harm the people around them. But again, it's a really complicated situation and there's no right answer with stuff like this. Everybody's just doing their best to get by and to try and make something that works for all of them. And I really like watching interviews that this author does because she mentions how this book is written for a trans audience. It's not meant to explain the experience to you because it's assuming that you already know it. Because so much trans literature is focused on teaching. It's focused on saying, here is the trans experience. So if you are somebody who has lived through that experience, you gain nothing from the book. This author chose to say, okay, let's assume we've all lived these experiences, now elaborate, now let's expand. And I'm really excited to see more authors do that in the future and to see how that elevates queer discussions in the future. I think that's gonna be really cool. And then the fifth book that I read in July goes into where most of these books came from, and this is a little awkward because I don't think that video's out yet. It's okay, we're gonna still talk about them. We're not gonna worry about it. I trust that you guys will still stick around when that video does come out. Consider this a sneak peek. So the fifth and the last book that I read in July was the first book of the Magnus Chase series. This series came out in the mid-2010s, and I was reading it when it came out, but I sort of lost interest along the way. I remember bits and pieces of it, but I don't think I ever finished the series the first time around. So it was incredibly nostalgic to get to go back to not just this series, but this author as a whole, because I was big into Percy Jackson, King Chronicles, all of that. The writing is pretty easy to get through. It is young adult, so it's meant to be easy to consume. But the biggest praise that I have for this book is the diversity. The representation and the diversity that this author manages to fit into each of his series is so admirable. I'm so grateful that I got to grow up on books like this where the author was so aware of other experiences, where there are people of color and people who are deaf and people who are trans. There are so many experiences in these books, and if you are a young person who's reading them, you're gonna grow up knowing that those things are okay. So I really appreciate this author for introducing so many young people to these different ways of living and the different struggles that people go through. It feels like there's genuine care that goes into each of these characters, and it's really special to read. And I could just be blindly saying that because I grew up on it and because I have childhood feelings about it, but I'm hoping that it's true. The story does occasionally feel a little bit dragged out because it is one of those save everybody from the end of the world type of stories, so you get stopped along the way, you have to do all these little mini quests on the way. But that's kind of just how these books go, and the ending does a pretty good job of drawing you back in and reminding you that you should still care because there are more books. Then that brings us to August, where I read 8 books. The first one that I read was The End of White Christian America by Robert P. Jones. Again, this was another assigned reading for school. I thought it was really interesting to read about the decline of Christian ideas in America and the whole strategy of clinging on to more conservative ideas in order to maintain the original supporters, because if you try to branch out, you could potentially lose everybody. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. It's talking about how groups will cling to more conservative beliefs and they'll try to be specifically this one thing because that's what their followers had, that's what their followers cling to, that's what they try to stick to and believe. But obviously in today's world, people are becoming a lot more accepting and people are changing their ideas. But if these more conservative groups try to branch out and they try to become more inclusive, they could lose the original followers that they have. And at the same time, if they branch out but other people are not accepting because they see how conservative they have been, then now nobody supports it. That's my very rough description, but I thought that was interesting, especially considering just the way that the country's been going. Again, not much to say about this book. It was another school read. There's a lot of history that does not stick in the brain, but ultimately this book says that there can't be reconciliation until there's recognition of the power imbalance throughout history. Lots of these groups try really hard to brush aside issues that they caused, and it simply isn't gonna happen until they admit that they are the root of the problem. sorry, that's just how it goes. The second book that I read was Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall. This is a book that I've been talking about for months and months. I started reading it for Women's History Month, but I put it down, finally got back to it, and I really enjoyed it. It's unapologetically presenting a perspective that most people choose to not consider. It's not that they don't know it exists, it's that it's easier to pretend it isn't there. In this book, you're talking about how feminism, just as a whole, tends to focus on women who are more privileged. And while yes, those women do need rights, and it's great that we're trying to fight for equality for them, it kind of undermines the issues of other people, women that are also people of color or that are also disabled, or all these other layers. It's saying that if we are going to be true feminists, we have to include everybody. You have to be able to acknowledge that some people have it worse than others, and you have to be able to fight for them to get them to the same level as the other women. We can't just boost up one type of woman and then say that there's equality. At times this book was kind of repetitive, but I also understand why it is, because all of these issues come back to that same idea. It is a little bit overwhelming to read. There are a lot of things that this book talks about. It goes into housing and education and poverty, women who are missing. This book talks about how everything that affects women is a feminist issue. So yes, poverty affects lots of people, but it is considered a feminist issue because women specifically are held back even more because of it. It's just a fact that some women are gonna be held to higher standards or are gonna have less opportunities based on the type of woman that they are. Some are gonna be valued more than others, and that's just not how we should be doing things. And I think this book is largely written for women who are more privileged, who maybe won't even consider these perspectives. Because if you are a person of color or you are a minority in any way, you probably are aware of a lot of these issues and how they affect you personally. But take somebody who is a straight cis white woman, they might not even know that these are issues because it's not something they ever had to face. So I do think this book is for everybody, but specifically for those women who otherwise wouldn't ever consider that this is a problem. You can't say that you're a feminist and then exclude women. The third book is one that I don't feel like pulling up because it's up there, but Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren. I don't need to talk too much about this. It's one of my favorite romances that I've ever read. I read it back in February and I reread it this month to go through and annotate it. I'll say all the same things I said before. I love the relationships. I love the communication. I think it's all so clear. I think the buildup is perfect. I think the conflict makes sense with how everybody reacted. It's a second chance romance. There's a 10-year time skip between when they were together the first time and when they're maybe getting together the second time. You're just trying to build up to what caused them to break up the first time. I read it over 2 days and genuinely my heart breaks with these characters every time. The fourth book that I read was Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford, and at first when I started reading this, I thought that I couldn't relate to it because it's an experience that's so different from mine. This is a memoir that's talking about Ashley's experience with a father who was incarcerated. So you're hearing about her relationship with her dad, but also her relationship with everybody else in her family and how they're reacting to the situation and how they all react to each other, where sometimes they're super supportive and they want to be there for each other, and other times they take out their anger at each other, and that's just the way that it goes. I thought I would not be able to connect to this book. I would just read it and then sort of move on. But at the end of the day, this book is about family, which most people have. Maybe you didn't have the same exact experience growing up, but you can see this relationship reflected in your own life. Or you have the same feelings as the author during this time, whatever it is. You don't have to relate to the big ideas to still find the story relatable. And it's not that it has to be relatable, but it feels good to be able to connect. Just on a human level, you know? And I thought this pairs well with some of the other books that I had been reading about religion and about race, because those things are relevant in this story. And I think being more informed about those topics made this more impactful, because you start thinking about how this situation would impact her as a woman, like with Hood Feminism, or with another book that I was reading that you'll see in a little bit, how her race affected this whole situation, or affected her father's situation, or whatever it is. You see how all of these things layer on top of each other, and the more informed you are, the more you're able to see it. And it just reminded me why education as a whole is so important. The more educated we are, the more we can see these problems just in everyday situations. I wrote that there are so many layers of pain and joy, and the author captures her experience in a way that shares pieces of her life with the reader. But the ending is absolutely devastating, and I hate that memoirs have to end this way so often. I have 4 books left. We're gonna try to get through this fast because I do not feel good at all. First one, and the one that I'm probably most excited to talk about out of all of these, is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I bought this book at the end of June and I wanted nothing more than to read it all in one sitting, but for whatever reason I held myself back and I didn't read it until mid-August, which I'm honestly kind of happy about because I also didn't want the story to end. I didn't want to have to say goodbye to these characters. In this book, you're following a woman who in the 1700s made a deal with the devil. She felt kind of overwhelmed by the pressure of of life and the idea that you have to settle down and you have to make all these big decisions that you follow through for the rest of forever. And she just wanted some more time. She didn't want to be forced to make any decisions about her life. She just wanted to experience things. And so, Mr. Trickster made a deal with her. She is now invincible, but she doesn't exist. She can interact with somebody, and the second that they turn a corner or they go through a door, they forget who she is. When they come back in, they see her as a new person. She doesn't age, she doesn't really get injured, she does still get hungry, she can still feel things, but there is no actual impact to her. And the main part of this curse is just that she can't leave her mark on the world. She wanted more time. She wanted to experience the world, but the world doesn't get to experience her. Which is kind of a big struggle, because for a lot of people, you want to be remembered. You want to feel like your life meant something and that you could leave your mark on the world. So this curse took that ability away from her. And in this book, you're following her, jumping between timelines of when she first got cursed 300 years ago and then present day. You're seeing as she learns all the different rules of what she's been given, as she tries to twist it to maybe be not so bad for herself, because this is just the way that she has to live now. And then, a little bit through the book, it becomes a split perspective because she meets somebody who remembers her. This book does feel a little bit repetitive, but that's kind of entirely the point, because this character, every time she introduces herself to somebody, has to relive that interaction every single time that they see her. So it is repetitive. She's repeating the same thing for 300 years. She never makes any meaningful connection. She never has anywhere that she can go that is her own. Every day, she has to restart, and you are living that with her. And then when you get to the split perspective, you get to see somebody else's thoughts about her. They both are struggling with the feeling of just not having enough time, feeling like your life is going to run out and you're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do. And I felt like I could relate a lot to these characters while I was reading it. I feel like I really read it at a good time for me, because I could feel a lot of the same things that the characters were feeling about wanting to get everything done and wanting to accomplish so many things, and you just know that it's not possible to get it all done. This is not a fun read, you know? Like, this is not something that you sit down and enjoy and then go about your day. This is something that will go with you. I think the writing in a lot of this is really beautiful, and I would love to go back through and annotate it because I didn't do any the first time. Next book is The Hammer of Thor. This is the second Magnus Chase book. I was kind of reaching for something a little bit lighter after all of those emotional, harder nonfiction books, and I wasn't sure if I read this, but then I was introduced to Alex and I remembered. In this book, you're still following the whole end of the world stuff. It's just slowly moving on to the big end of the world battle that comes up in the third book. But in this book, you're introduced to Alex, who is gender fluid. This is probably my first and probably only time seeing a gender fluid character in literature. I don't know that I've ever seen it since then, but this character has stuck with me for close to a decade at this point, and I'm sure it meant a lot to so many queer readers who were into these books at the time. I specifically think it handles her gender really well because it doesn't let you know what she was assigned at birth. It just doesn't matter. Honestly, I don't even remember what happens in this book. It's very much a mid-series book where you're just kind of moving things along, but nothing really matters. And at the very ending, it suggests a crossover with Percy Jackson, who I have not visited since my middle school years, so that, honestly, it made me want to throw up. Not in a bad way, though. Just the idea of it. It was a lot to take in. And of course, that brings us to the third book, The Ship of the Dead, which, first of all, I just love that the cover kind of mirrors something that Percy Jackson would be doing. With the orange shirt and the sword in the water, it just looks very Percy Jackson. It made me very happy just to look at. But in this book, they're kind of racing for the final end of the world battle. Their main enemy throughout this whole series is Loki, and in this one, he's trying to sail a ship that will essentially signal the end of the world happening, and they're trying to make it to the ship to stop him before he can do that. I don't know that I made it this far into the series the first time that I read it. I don't really remember anything that happened in this, but I just care less about this book than the other two. I don't know what it is about it. It might just be the fact that this is supposed to be the final book. This is supposed to be the big deal, where if they don't complete it, then the end of the world is gonna happen. But it just felt too casual for how big the consequence would be. With the other two books, it felt like the stakes were higher, even though the consequence was not as severe. But with this one, it was the actual end of the world happening, and it didn't really feel like it mattered. It's also not as long as the other ones. I feel like there were a lot of points where it could have gone more in depth and it could have really spent some time with these ideas, and it sort of just sped through. So I didn't care that much, even though this should have been the biggest deal. And I also think because of death of a main character or lack thereof, it just felt incomplete. It didn't feel like there was any point where I was stressed with them. There was nothing that happened that was surprising to me. I like that it wraps up by going full circle, but overall, I just wasn't that entertained by this one. I do think it could have been wrapped up a lot better, and that was disappointing, but it's okay because I still had a really good time visiting the series, and it does make me want to go pick up Percy Jackson again. And then the last book that I have to talk about is one that I have been reading since February. Not like Hood Feminism, where I picked it up and then put it down until now, but I have been actively reading it since February. I feel like this happens to me every year. I'll pick one book that I just cannot get through. A couple years ago, it was a Jules Verne book. Last year, it was the Vampire Chronicles. And this year, the winner goes to Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. It took 6 months, but we did it. I put this book into a TBR from, I think, this time last year, honestly. I felt like I had to read this the right way in order to understand everything that was said in it. But even reading it and just getting some of the information is still beneficial because I can always go back. I own this book. I can just go and read it again. You don't have to become a master of a subject the first time that you're being introduced to it. In this book, the author is talking about how the caste system is typically something that you associate with India, but we have it here in America, where people exist in different ranks based on their race. It establishes the problems of this country and the whole caste setup and why it's relevant pretty early in the book. So it's not just throwing you in, it does clearly say, hey, here's what we're going to be talking about. And the chapters are short enough to where it doesn't feel super overwhelming. It feels like you can just do it a little bit at a time. But this book made me feel dirty on the inside for reading it. Just at the idea that some of these things happen, because it goes into how people treated slaves and how people treated people of color all throughout American history, and it just feels so gross to know that there's nothing that we can actively do to change that. There are so many issues with our current society, and as individuals, we can't change it, so it can feel impossible because you feel like there's no way you can possibly influence those people to change their behaviors, or to even acknowledge the history of bad behaviors. And it sucks to see that school systems are trying to get rid of that information. I don't know how it is in other places, but in Florida, Mr. Ron over here is making rules to essentially ban discussions about the poor treatment of people of color because it would make white people feel bad. So instead we should just erase this entire history and pretend that white people are superior just because they are, instead of acknowledging the fact that they're in power because they completely destroyed other groups. Books like this are so important because they acknowledge the things that people are trying to erase. These stories are graphic and they're uncomfortable. You don't want to read about public lynchings. You don't want to think about torture methods, but they happened. They are real things that have happened within the past 100, 200 years. These are things that still affect people today, either because that was their family members or because it happened in the town that they live in and other people still believe that it's okay. There are so many reasons why this is still relevant, and it is so garbage that people are trying to erase that from history. I don't know enough to accurately talk about it, but I know enough to know that you shouldn't do that. And like I've said with a couple of the other books, this book felt repetitive, but it's because history is repetitive. There's a lot of talk about segregation and the different things that these people go through. They keep going through the same things. They shouldn't have to go through the same things. Every time there is a step forward, for example, having a black president, people see that as proof that racism doesn't exist. That there has been change, that look, the person in power is a person of color, therefore people of color are treated equally. It's just so not true. I'm happy that I read this book, and I recommend that you guys read it too, because we all need to make more effort to educate ourselves on things that people are trying to take away. It just sucks a lot. I wish I was more informed so I could have a better take about that, but this has been a very chaotic week. There was a hurricane on Tuesday, and then I've spent the past 3 days stuck in bed watching Ethan Is Online and nothing else. I haven't done a single thing. I am not feeling good at all, but I told myself I was getting back into videos, so I wanted to at least do this. That has drained my energy for the week, so we're gonna call it. If you like my face and you want to see more of it, you can subscribe to this channel or my main channel, Riverbxnd, where I post music content, or my Instagram, Spotify, Goodreads, and Storygraph, which I will have linked in the description. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye.